Donald Trump was in Quantico, Virginia. There was a very mysterious ethos to this gathering because it was reported that Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of War, had ordered senior military commanders from all over the world to travel to Quantico in order to gather for what was an unspecified reason. And of course, it led a lot of people to wonder whether the U.S. has some planned military operation that it needed to brief its senior commanders on, or what was the purpose. The purpose was kind of kept under wraps. Pete Hegseth ended up speaking to those military commanders, made a lot of statements, a lot of decrees, including chiding various people who are senior in the military for being overweight, for being slovenly in their appearance. He talked about what he called, quote, dudes in dresses, and said all of that ends, kind of essentially announcing a restoration of what had been standard military expectations for many decades, I guess, until a new sort of philosophy ended up shaping the American military in recent years. And one can debate whether those old standards of fitness and ideology and presentation, he also talked about the male standards of fitness, were actually appropriate when there was a certain kind of war fighting, and may not be as appropriate now, where a lot is done by things like drones or technology or other kinds of support roles, or whether or not the military can only function, a good military can only function if it has discipline, and that discipline can be reflected by those personal traits. In general, I do think it's actually quite disturbing when our culture is told that being overweight is somehow not just acceptable, but even as good as the alternative. I think there's a lot of reasons to tell people that although they shouldn't be ashamed of it, there certainly should be a clear consensus, as exists in medicine, that being in shape, being fit is something that is very good for you, not just physically, but also mentally, the need for physical exercise. I don't have a problem with that. So at some point, maybe we'll discuss the Pete Hegseth part of that discussion, but I want to focus on what President Trump said, because he essentially came with a prepared speech that he was reading off of a teleprompter, and as often happens, he gets very bored when he's just reading from a teleprompter. It's not his skill. It's not what has driven his political success. Instead, he started talking about a bunch of, I think, extremely relevant and potentially consequential issues, kind of off the cuff. So part of this is from the teleprompter script, and then part of these comments are things that he spontaneously or contemporaneously just kind of decided to say. I think the set here was very deliberately a replica of a famous set that was used by General Patton, I believe in the film, actually, where General Patton gave one of his most famous military addresses. But in any event, here's what President Trump said at this gathering.
That's what it is. Only in recent decades did politicians somehow come to believe that our job is to police the far reaches of Kenya and Somalia, while America is under invasion from within. We're under invasion from within. No different than a foreign enemy, but more difficult in many ways because they don't wear uniforms. At least when they're wearing a uniform, you can take them out. These people don't have uniforms. But we are under invasion from within. We're stopping it very quickly.
Now, the first part of that statement references what has become, in my view, a very valid critique of American foreign policy, which is the idea that we are responsible for policing every part of the world, that we go to Somalia and we bomb whoever we decide needs to be bombed, or we try and change the government of this country and that country. And while this has been a common critique of President Trump, it's not really consistent with how he has presided over the executive branch, either in the first term or now in the second. The United States military has frequently, for example, bombed Somalia. Under President Trump's presidency, we bombed lots of different places that seem quite remote in terms of American interests. And of course, we are very much in the process, and at some point we'll delve into this a little bit further, of launching what clearly seems to be an effort to at least destabilize, if not bring about regime change, in Venezuela. And of course, it's being presented as an attempt to protect American communities from drug smuggling, but for so many reasons that rationale crumbles upon the slightest bit of real scrutiny, including the fact that if you look at government reports about where drugs that are entering the United States are coming from, Venezuela barely rates, and yet we've been killing all sorts of people in various boats without any evidence presented by our government that they're drug traffickers. Those people aren't wearing uniforms, and yet, as President Trump said, it's very difficult to kill people when they're not wearing uniforms. That was the lesson of the war on terror. You end up killing huge numbers of innocent civilians. So there was that critique that President Trump often expresses, like, why are we continuing to be involved in so many wars around the world? President Trump just announced, his administration did, that we're going to increase certain parts of our support, including intelligence sharing with the Ukrainians on how better to target bombing inside of Russia. And there's a lot of those kinds of policies that seem quite inconsistent with this rhetoric about how we have to use our force and our military to protect our borders. But then there's the other side of that equation, which is that President Trump says we are being attacked from within, that we have an enemy within, basically a domestic enemy. And the Constitution does envision the fact that there may be not just foreign enemies, but domestic enemies and threats that emanate from foreign countries, but also threats that emanate from within. And if President Trump means by this that there's a threat from within in the form of people pouring over the border illegally, I think a lot of people would be okay with that view, as evidenced by the fact that President Trump ran 3 times with that view as a centerpiece of his political campaign, winning twice and almost winning a 3rd time. So clearly that has been, if that's what he meant, a view that is very consistent with how President Trump has conceived of the world and convinced Americans to see it as well. I don't think that's what he means, though, for a lot of different reasons, including the fact that there's no one that can doubt that the policies that have been implemented by the Trump administration since the inauguration have all but stopped completely the flow of people across the border in the southern part of the United States, where they had been pouring over by the millions under the Biden administration. And we kept hearing from Democrats that President Biden was powerless to stop this, that it required bipartisan legislative solutions, that Trump had sabotaged. They were trying to blame Trump for it. And as it turned out, without any immigration legislation, the Trump administration has succeeded, whatever you think of the methods, in putting a stop to the huge number of people pouring over the border. So that's clearly not what he means when he's talking about an invasion from within or an enemy within. And another reason that you know that's not what he means is that he is describing the intention that President Trump has to deploy U.S. National Guard and other types of reserves, or even the U.S. military, onto the streets of American cities. And the pretext or the justification for his doing so has nothing to do with immigration. It has to do with what he perceives as rampant law and order problems, as happened in Washington, where there were violent crimes that provoked him to deploy the National Guard and other federal troops and law enforcement into Washington, D.C. He also wanted to do that and did do that in California. He's now thinking about or wanting to do it in Oregon, including in states where the governor has, including California and Oregon, where the governor has made clear they don't think that deployment is necessary, and they don't actually want federal troops being deployed, which creates a huge legal and constitutional barrier for this type of deployment to take place. Now, as I said, it is not inconceivable, it is not alien to the concept of our Constitution that threats might come both from foreign and domestic sources. But whenever the president starts talking about the enemy within or the threat within, unless he's being very specific about exactly which threat he's talking about, that rhetoric always has the potential to become quite dangerous, because that is the path down which things like suppression of political dissent resides, or using the military for political purposes. And I'm not suggesting that President Trump intends that or that he is guilty of that. I'm simply suggesting that when we get to the point where politicians start talking about using the U.S. military, using extra police force in order to deploy on domestic soil for whatever kinds of ends, including fighting the enemy within, that is rhetoric that has often led to some of the worst abuses in American history, and that ought to increase our alert level whenever the president starts speaking that way. And we do have in our tradition, as we'll get to in just a second, a variety of laws that reflect this ethos that the federal government was never supposed to have this standing police force. This whole idea of the law enforcement branch of the executive, of the United States government, overseen by the executive branch, to have these standing armies of armed law enforcement agents, of the DEA or the bureau that oversees guns and alcohol and tobacco, or all these different branches of the FBI or Homeland Security. That is very foreign to the idea of the founders. In fact, the idea of the founders was we wouldn't even have a standing military at all. That only in times of war would the executive be empowered to assemble a well-regulated militia that would then end up turning into a military. The president would then become the commander-in-chief. But we weren't supposed to have just a standing army, a country always at war or ready to go to war or in a war posture. And so much of this amassing of federal power and federal paramilitarized power or just overtly militarized power is something that is very distant from the vision that not just the founders had, but that the people in the United States had for the first 100 years or so. This kind of an imagined police force of sprawling paramilitarized power is something that they couldn't even conceive of. And when we start talking about employing that or unleashing it on our own citizens in our own cities, I would submit that that is something that requires a great deal of concern. And there's legal frameworks like the Posse Comitatus Act, which I'm not suggesting yet is directly in violation of what Trump intends to do, but it's certainly reflective of this understanding that deploying the military on American soil is something that, except in the most extreme circumstances, we ought to insist be avoided. Now, here's the rest of what Trump said, where, again, he kind of went off script. This was not part of his prepared remarks in the teleprompter, but this is Trump just sort of musing about the problem that he raised in that prior clip.
Very important mission. And I told Pete we should use some of these dangerous cities as training grounds for our military, National Guard, but military. Because we're going into Chicago very soon. That's a big city with an incompetent governor, stupid. They threw him out of his family business. He was so stupid. I know the family. He becomes governor. He's got money. Not money that he made, but he ran for governor, he won, and now he criticizes us all the time. And last week they had 11 people murdered, 44 people shot. The week before that they had 5 people murdered, 28 people shot. Every weekend they lose 5, 6. If they lose 5, they're considering it a great week. They shouldn't lose any.
So what he's talking about there clearly are standard police functions that are typically left to American municipalities. In almost every city, cities are patrolled by the police department that is under the control of the mayor. And then you have the National Guard that is under the control of the governor. And you have a Democrat running the city of Chicago, and you have, in Brandon Johnson, you have a Democratic governor who Trump was referring to there, Governor Pritzker, who's also a Democrat. Neither of them have asked for, and both of them have made clear they do not want the intervention of the U.S. military or the National Guard under the command of President Trump in American cities. And it's certainly true that the crime rate in Chicago is more than what most people think it ought to be. And I suppose there might be some people who just immediately react and say, well, look, wherever there's crime, just send in the military and they'll take care of the problem. That comes with immense cost once you start becoming a country that's policed and governed by the U.S. military, controlled by politicians that don't know these cities in Washington, D.C., or controlled by the president who has conflict with the Democratic politicians running these places. It is a recipe for a lot of instability and for much worse as well. And I understand how President Trump works. I understand that he floats ideas in order to kind of test what it is that he can do, test the limits of what he can do, or just kind of express dissatisfaction through threatening these kind of policies. I'm not trying to sound an alarm that is premature. I'm simply saying that once we get into rhetoric that's about the deployment of the National Guard, or worse, the military, on American soil, we ought to be very concerned, particularly when it's not for warding off invasion or some kind of an insurrection, which he's not even purporting that it is. The justification, which is just street crime, is not what the U.S. military or the National Guard is intended to combat. And this has been something that has been on Trump's mind for quite a while. He first did implement it when it came to the District of Columbia, which is sort of its own creature because it's not a state. It's under home rule, and therefore the federal government does have a lot of authority when it comes to the District of Columbia. And this is what the White House did in August on August 25th, which is issue this presidential action, the title of which was Additional Measures to Address the Crime Emergency in the District of Columbia. And part of the text read this, quote, the Secretary of Defense shall immediately begin ensuring that each state's Army National Guard and Air National Guard are resource trained, organized, and available to assist federal, state, and local law enforcement in quelling civil disturbances and ensuring the public's safety and order whenever the circumstances necessitate, as appropriate under law. In coordination with the respective adjutant general, the Secretary of Defense shall designate an appropriate number of each state's trained National Guard members to be reasonably available for rapid mobilization for such purposes. In addition, the Secretary of Defense shall ensure the availability of a standing National Guard quick reaction force that shall be resource trained and available for rapid nationwide deployment. And one of the things you did see was a very visible presence of military and National Guard all throughout Washington, although it seemed like they weren't really doing much. They were often doing things like trash collection or just standing around. There were a lot of videos where residents of Washington were saying, why are you here? And they would kind of respond and say, I don't really know. So it can be kind of just a symbolic assertion of force, or it can be something much more sinister. It can be an attempt by the executive branch, by the president, to control domestic activity, domestic civil activity, domestic civic activity, surveillance, and even domestic political activity, because obviously deploying the National Guard or the military under the command of the president in American cities is something that has obvious potential for extreme amounts of abuse, and that's the reason why it's not really within the American tradition to do so, except in the most extreme circumstances. This is rhetoric that Trump has been playing with for quite a while. Here in Madison Square Garden, where he held one of his last large rallies before the 2024 election, this is part of what he said.
A massive, vicious, crooked, radical left machine that runs today's Democrat Party. They're just vessels. In fact, they're perfect vessels because they'll never give them a hard time. They'll do whatever they want. I know many of them. It's just this amorphous group of people. But they're smart and they're vicious. And we have to defeat them. And when I say the enemy from within, the other side goes crazy, becomes a sound. Oh, how can he say? No, they've done very bad things to this country. They are indeed the enemy from within. And
so he makes clear that's what his rhetoric is. When he says the enemy within, that's from within. That's why I was saying it's not about people coming across the border illegally or staying in the United States illegally. It's about what he considers to be a left-wing machine, a left-wing political machine that's obviously his political opponents. And there definitely have been aspects of civic disorder that have come from various left-wing elements over the past 5 years. Certainly the the summer of the George Floyd protests entailed a decent amount of that. There are pockets of places like in Portland or Seattle where at times the authorities seem either unwilling or incapable of asserting any authority in small parts of cities. But the idea that there's some sort of massive insurrectionary force taking over the United States is exactly the kind of extremely exaggerated threat assertions that we ought to be very guarded against, because that's the kind of thing that leads to authoritarian power. Do you know those nights when you just don't sleep? I actually had one of those nights within the last week. They're miserable, and then the next day you're dragging and you're exhausted and everything just feels heavier and harder. That's where CBD from CB Distillery can really make a big difference. It's not just sleep though. CB Distillery has all kinds of organic solutions that work with your body to help do things like reduce stress or alleviate pain after exercise, or even improve your mood and focus. And it's all made with the highest quality, clean ingredients. No fillers, just premium CBD. So imagine waking up rested or enjoying your day without those nagging aches and pains. That's the real win of CB Distillery solutions. That's why over 2 million people trust CB Distillery. It's why I've used it for all sorts of just little nagging injuries that I get. I'm an extremely good tennis player at a very, very high level. I could easily beat Bill Ackman, and yet sometimes when I play, I still get pains despite how fit my body is and agile and flexible. And when I have these kind of pains, just like in my wrist or other ligaments or whatever, I do use CBD. They have this like little pain stick, and you rub it on, and you feel it. I'm not kidding. Just try it. I'm serious. I know it sounds like it's the sort of thing you say when you're doing an ad, but it really does work, and you should try it yourself. So if you're ready for better sleep or less stress or feeling good in your own skin again, try CBD from CB Distillery. And right now, you can save 25% off your entire purchase. Visit CB Distillery and use the promo code GLENN. That's cbdistillery.com, promo code GLENN. cbdistillery.com, specific product availability depends on individual state regulations. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.